Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us for wherever you are. I'm Bob Hamilton. I am the head of research in FPRI's Eurasia division, and I'm your moderator for today's event, Partners or Rivals, Areas of Convergence and Divergence in China-Russia Relations in the Indo-Pacific. So thank you to the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command for its sponsorship of not only this report, but the four that preceded it in the series on Chinese-Russian relations in the Indo-Pacific. Thanks to Tom Shattuck and Dr. Alexander Korolev for joining us today to discuss their report. I will introduce them briefly and then turn it over to them for their thoughts on the report. And then we'll go to a moderated Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat, but in the Q&A box here on Zoom. So Dr. Alexander Korolev is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the School of Social Sciences, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. Thomas J. Shattuck is a fellow in the Eurasia program here at FPRI and a senior program manager at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse. He's a 2024-25 WSD Handa Fellow at the Pacific Forum and a 24-25 non-resident research fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. The full bios of both Alex and Tom are on the website for this event. So let me turn it over, Alex, to you. You guys have structured this report in a really interesting way. I think you look at the systemic level or the level of the international system, and then you look at the regional level inside the Indo-Pacific. And you talk about relations between China and Russia at both of these levels. So Alex, you're going to handle the systemic level. Tom, you'll handle the regional level, and I will turn it over to you in that order for your comments, and then we'll go to a moderated Q&A. Alex, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Bob, and I appreciate the opportunity to present for Foreign Policy Research Institute. Systemic level. The question is, at the systemic level, why are China-Russia aligned, and is this alliance or alignment, it's not really an alliance, informal alignment, sustainable or not? And to answer this question, we sort of went back to IR theory to identify the primary causal forces that drive alignments between states. So why states form alliances or informal alignments? And there are three primary causes. Of course, there are more situational causes, but there are three primary causes. And these three are what I call a theory of three balances. The first one is balance of power. The second one is the balance of threat. And the third one is the balance of interests. So these are the three kind of primary causes that drive alliance formation. According to balance of power, the logic is very simple. It originates from structural realism. And according to this argument, alliance formation is a way to restore the balance of power condition. So a balance of power condition is presented as some sort of a law of gravity, if you like, system. All international system always goes back to the balance of power because unbalanced international system is not stable according to this approach. So when we looked at China-Russia relations, we looked at this factor, and I will get to the empirical analysis in a moment. The second cause is the balance of threat. So according to this theory, originally developed by Stephen Walt, states form alliances to deal with external threats, not simply power predominance. No threat means no alignment. So states form alliances to deal with the most threatening, not simply strongest states. And the third balance, so-called the balance of interests, according to this theory, formulated by Randall Schweller, states form alliances to protect certain interests. And by interests, we mean status quo interest or revisionist interest. Basically, whether and with whom states establish alliances depends on states' understanding of their mutual interests. Particularly, status quo states align with each other because they share interest of maintaining the existing world order and containing the revisionist states, whereas revisionist states align with each other because they see more benefits in the changes of the system. So these are the so-called theory of three balances. And if we apply it to China-Russia relations, we will see that alignment is expectable. It should be expected. There is, from the standpoint of the balance of power, the United States remains the most powerful systemic player at the global level. However, the gap, the power gap between the US and China plus Russia is less insurmountable compared to, let's say, the year of 2000. In the year of 2000, China's GDP was less than 10% of the US's GDP. Now, again, depends how you calculate on how you calculate it. Sometimes it's 60%, sometimes it's 70%. Russia, which is quite often presented as a declining power, actually experienced a 14-fold increase of GDP compared to mid-1990s, and military expenditures increased tenfold since early 1990s. So also Russia went through massive rearmament programs in the early 2000s. So what we witness now is a system that is led by a regular superpower, if we can put it that way. So in early 2000s, the United States was a hyperpower, if you like. If you add up China's, Russia's capabilities and the capabilities of the next five largest powers, they wouldn't get even close to the level of the United States. So now this is no longer the case. So if you add up China and Russia, you will get to, again, it's a very crude kind of measurement, but you will get very close to the Cold War power structure, with the United States being a regular superpower, more powerful than China and Russia. So this, according to the balance of power theory, this configuration is the most conducive to alignment between in our case, China and Russia. And interestingly, some congressional reports in the US, I think dated by the year of 2020, stated that US might struggle or even might lose in a direct conflict with China if China is fully supported by Russia. So this means that from the standpoint of balance of power theory, China-Russia alignment is highly likely. If we look at the balance of threat, it's also quite interesting how the perception of the United States by China and Russia evolved over the last 20 years from some sort of a remote and distant threat into an existential threat. So if we look at the Russian and Chinese documents, especially the bilateral statements coming out from meetings between high-level military officials, diplomats, even top decision makers, Putin and Xi Jinping, will see the sort of routinization, normalization of presenting the United States as a primary threat. And this spreads to the regional perspective, in a sense that both China and Russia express concerns about the Indo-Pacific, about the United States' policies in the South China Sea region. Quite interestingly, Russia sort of adopted China's perspective on the US's policies in the South China Sea region, viewing both Quad and AUKUS and this freedom of navigation operations as an attempt to encircle China, to isolate, to contain China. And China more or less aligns with Russia's strategic concerns. Like, for example, Chinese domestic discourse on the Ukraine crisis. If we look at it, we'll see that it by and large replicated Russia's perspective, namely that it's all because of NATO expansion, that the West poses an existential threat. So this is the second factor, right? Balance of threats. From that standpoint, again, China-Russia alignment is likely because both powers increasingly view the United States as an existential threat, and it comes out increasingly kind of popped up in foreign policy documents. Most of them are not translated into English, but if colleagues can read like Chinese or Russian, you can see it's quite clear. For example, that something along the lines like in the Asia-Pacific, the United States is interested in maintaining unipolarity and so on and so forth. And we will put our efforts together. We will act in a coordinated way to resist this unipolarity. And the third factor, the balance of interests, if you like, if we look at that, again, we see the rising revisionism in both China and Russia. And it's not just kind of verbal, articulated revisionism, but also it evolved into an announcement of an intention to coordinate policies, to undertake relevant actions to change the existing world order, and we see China is trying to do it through by introducing alternative financial institutions like AIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Also, we see a BRICS bank, attempts to establish a BRICS bank. We see kind of the different views on primary international institutions such as the United Nations. So from the three balances, again, these are not all the possible causes of alliance formation, but these are the primary ones, the systemic ones. From these three angles, if we look at China-Russia relations, then alignment is likely. The recent changes, at the same time, there is nothing sacred about China-Russia alignment or any other alliance. I think that there is that Donald Trump has introduced a lot of uncertainty into this configuration by not removing, by sort of reconfiguring the threat perception, at least in Russia, because this kind of deprioritization of European security and comprehensive reorientation to the Indo-Pacific. I'm not saying that it will drive a wedge between China and Russia, but we will see in the next few years. There are still many questions remain unanswered. For example, is it a sustainable? Is it a pattern, or is it some sort of idiosyncrasy due to Trump's leadership style? But as I mentioned, China-Russia, I view alliance and alignments as again, alignment of interests, perceptions of threats. So if those variables change, then alignment might change. And another factor to consider, sort of looking ahead, is that it looks like the roles, again, if Trump's foreign policy initiatives in the form of deprioritizing NATO and European security are long-term, then this reorientation to Asia to contain China more explicitly is real, then China might need Russia a lot, like the same way Russia needed China during the Ukraine crisis. So again, this introduces another layer of complexity, because Russia might not see the US as an existential threat anymore. However, China will see the United States as the primary threat. And this means that China will likely compromise in its cooperation with Russia. We see it a little bit unfolding recently when China becomes more sensitive to Russia's economic concerns, for example, and becomes more, the biggest pain for Russia is that it is an energy appendage of China. And Xi has been quite responsive to Putin's concerns regarding this highly unbalanced pattern of bilateral trade, and there are some attempts to introduce more high-tech technological cooperation into bilateral economic and strategic interactions. So this is what I'd like to say about this so-called systemic level. So the alignment of three balances as primary drivers of China-Russia strategic cooperation, and again a lot of uncertainty after Trump took office, and I think it remains to be seen if those changes are real or just some sort of aberrations from a bigger pattern.
All right, thanks, Alex, for that overview of what sort of is driving what appears to be greater convergence at the systemic or international level of the international system. Let's turn it over to you, Tom, and drop down to the Indo-Pacific region. And can you give us an overview of what the relationship looks like from that perspective?
Yeah, so thanks, Bob, for having us talk. We had a really great time writing this report, and Alex provided a really great overview at the systemic level. I'll provide four regional specific issues that could potentially create divergences, but in the end, we seem to conclude that none of them are necessarily strong enough to break the systemic level closeness that the two countries have. So I'm going to discuss the economics, history between Russia, China, Vietnam, and the South China Sea, and then I'm going to close off with India and how these four issues can create tension, but whether or not that could spiral into a deeper issue between the two. So with economics, Alex talked a bit about that at the end, where the economic disparity between the two countries is very significant, especially after the war in Ukraine. The sanctions that were put on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine really hurt the country. However, that created an opportunity for Russia to sell oil to other countries, namely China and India. So now Russia is very important for cheaper Chinese, or the Chinese for the Russian cheaper oil and gas. It's important, however, as Alex mentioned, for the PRC to make sure, at least at the top level, because there is tension at the lower level, that Russia is not considered or perceived as a vassal state of China because of its energy that it can provide the PRC. But the continuation of the Russia-Ukraine war will continue to make energy important for Russia to export. And the PRC itself has a much greater economy, and it is much more important for the Russians than necessarily the Russian economy is for the Chinese economy. So there will have to be, as Alex mentioned, some not necessarily rebalancing, but some concessions made on the PRC part to make it seem as if the Russian economy can have more value to the PRC, and particularly in the high-tech areas. In the historical issues between Russia and China, during the Century of Humiliation, there was a treaty that ceded some Chinese land to Russia in what we now know the Russian Far East. As the PRC population continues to expand, and given the geography and the sparse population of the Far East, Xi Jinping or a future leader may set their sights north, and that is considered a possibility. But again, while the two countries have different perceptions of the Far East and even Xinjiang, it is not necessarily going to be an issue that puts the two at the moment at odds. Countries across the world have different perceptions of different types of treaties and different types of historical relationships. And at the time being, Putin and Xi have seemed to move beyond that, and the historical nationalism that may exist between the two countries may be strong at the level of the normal population, but the leadership has decided to kind of push that aside for greater collaboration on other issues. For Vietnam in the South China Sea, we know that the PRC has essentially dominated the region since Xi Jinping's failed promise not to militarize the South China Sea when he made that famous statement during the Obama administration. That did not happen. In 2016, the PRC lost an arbitral case that the Philippines put forth on certain issues related to the PRC claims, especially within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. But what really matters in the context of the South China Sea isn't the Philippines or isn't other claimant states further south, but Vietnam. Vietnam has a strong historical relationship with Russia. They recently celebrated the 30th anniversary of their friendship treaty. Putin himself went down to Vietnam to have that kind of celebration. He came out with a lot of bilateral deals. However, Vietnam is one of the 8 claimant states to the South China Sea dispute. And the PRC in particular has pushed back on a lot of Vietnamese claims on islands and also on energy exploration. And on the energy point, Russian oil companies are critical for the ability for the Vietnamese to actually explore some of these energy pockets in the South China Sea. We've seen in the past the Vietnam try to put for like explore these areas with the Coast Guard to protect it, and then the PRC just comes in and pushes them out. It's been a bit more stable recently, and the Vietnamese have been a little more successful in at least exploring these things. However, given the fact that Russia is a strong partner and it has a deep historical relationship that goes back into the Cold War with Vietnam, and the fact that the Chinese invaded Vietnam in the past, that could create tension if push comes to shove, the tensions in the South China Sea spark into a conflict or just like a minor gun battle, which has happened in the past in the South China Sea with varying disputed states against the PRC. So if that were to happen, what would Russia do? I think Russia has towed a very fine line there, and it hasn't necessarily been something that causes pain in the relationship that it has with Vietnam. And as long as Russia continues to follow that path, I don't think that the South China Sea issue is going to be too important for that to be a breaking point with Russia and China. And if things were to escalate significantly, it's likely, given the state of affairs, that the systemic level will prevail, and the South China Sea is not necessarily a top 10 or top 20 issue for Russia. So you're going to cede that interest to the PRC for the sake of that relationship and other interests that you have there. Um, and finally, Russia's relationship with India and China's relationship with India. Again, like Vietnam, Russia has a strong historical relationship with India. And after the war in Ukraine, India, like China, has benefited from significantly cheaper energy imports. In May of this year, oil per barrel per day reached a 10-year high from imports from Russia into India. So India is getting a lot of that cheap oil from Russia because there are fewer markets. Another thing that Russia has with India that strengthens that relationship is Russia's military equipment that India buys. A very recent example of that is not just the fact that these sales are happening, but the fact that these things are actually being effective is the recent India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir, where the Russian S-400s that India purchased from Russia were actually very effective. And I believe it was Sergei Lavrov who actually commented on that, saying, oh, these systems are actually very useful for you. And in that announcement, the Russians said that the remaining 3 of the 5 orders would be completed very quickly. So India is still buying Russian military equipment. That's created tensions with India and the United States, where the Trump officials have complained about that and promising that things will change quickly. I don't necessarily think that will happen because India has a stronger arms relationship with Russia. There may be a bit of a balance, but they're not going to abandon Russian equipment given that relationship. A second issue that could happen is over India China issues are in the Himalayas and the line of actual control. Recently, the PRC has renamed some of the disputed areas into Chinese names, and it will be key to see when a Russian or a Kremlin released document refers to one of these areas, which name are they using? Are they using the Chinese version, or are they using the Indian version, or are they going to do a cop out like we do kind of in Asia with disputed islands, like we call the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands? Are they going to use both? And the naming of the use of whatever terms that they use will kind of say which side that they're going for. And that could cause tensions on either side. If the Russians use the Indian name, tensions with China. If they use the Chinese names, tensions with India. However, the recent ones are not the only time this has happened. China's renamed other areas in past years, and it hasn't been a huge problem in either relationship. So again, I think with Russia-China relations, things are too important at the systemic level that Russia will allow such things, or China will allow such very specific things to affect the relationship. And even with Russia and India, where the sovereignty of these areas in the Himalayas are important for India, there are other things that India cares about as much. So they're not going to tank relations on either side, China or Russia, or China and India with Russia over such things with the Himalayas. So again, I think Russia in a lot of these areas, particularly the regional touch points in the South China Sea and in the Himalayas, Russia's navigated them well, and given tensions that these other countries have with China, Russia's been able to maintain strong relationships with the disputant or the combatant states, as well as with China, and have moved forward. In the future, the question is now with the Trump administration, can Trump pull off a reverse Kissinger? I don't think it's likely. I think that at the moment the ties are so strong, and I believe what Alex was saying is very correct, and that Trump would have to really de-emphasize or give away something, perhaps all of Ukraine or NATO, for a reverse Kissinger type of situation to happen. I don't think that's plausible. And I think that if Trump were to give up something so significant, it would not necessarily pull Russia away from China. It would just make the relationship a little bit better with the United States, but Russia and China, because the systemic level relationship is so strong, it is going to be very difficult in the present day to pull them away with Putin and Xi in charge.
Okay, Tom, thanks for that overview at the regional level. Let's jump back up to the systemic level. Let me pose this question to you, Alex. You used the term alignment several times to describe the dynamic between Russia and China at the level of the international system. Alignment's not alliance, right? These are different things. But you will hear people talk about the China-Russia relationship at that level in terms of it being an alliance. Tell us a little bit about your view, the difference between alignment and alliance there, and is an alliance likely? Putin has said in the past that he could see it potentially, a military alliance, but can you give us a perspective on that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I consistently use term alignment instead of alliance to describe China-Russia relations. But the primary difference is that there are no formal defense obligations between China and Russia. So there is no alliance treaty as such, even though treaty is a tricky thing. Like if you look at this treaty of strategic cooperation and good neighborliness signed in the year of 2001, there are two clauses that kind of read like a treaty. Even if you look at the NATO agreements, you can also debate about the nature and the procedures of mobilization of forces to provide protection. But the primary difference between alliance and alignment is that China and Russia have been reluctant to announce an alliance, have been reluctant to formalize their relationship into an alliance. So absence of security obligation is the key. However, alignment is still a significant level, high level of strategic cooperation, because the way I use the term is that it's a strategic alignment, which means it's not an ad hoc reaction or knee-jerk reaction to situations or deteriorations in U.S.-Russia or U.S.-China relations. So primary like strategic alignment is driven by this three balances in my view. But yes, the difference is that it's sort of more reversible. I would say alignment is more reversible than alliance because there are no obligations, and when there are no formal obligations, there are no reputational costs if like expectations are not delivered on or not fulfilled. So I think China and Russia want to maintain this flexibility and sort of which allows them to either scale back a little bit or at the same time announce the relationship is higher or more advanced than an alliance. The most recent formulation is that it goes beyond an alliance. So yeah, it's less formalized, it's more reversible, but at the same time, it's strategically driven. This is how I apply the term.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And then one more, a follow-up for you. So you characterize both China and Russia as revisionist powers at the level of the international system. So what drives their revisionism? What do they want revised in the system? And what are their objectives for replacing the current system? In other words, whether we would call it a rules-based order or a liberal order, international order. They call it U.S. hegemony. But so the question is, what drives their revisionism, and what outcome does each want, and are those outcomes compatible?
Yeah, this is a good question. They are compatible, but they're not the same, I would say. And there is a little bit of a gap between the two revisionisms. China's revisionism is in the form of sort of requesting more space, more leverage in the existing global institutions. The China is an economic superpower, but again, it works very hard on, and its geopolitical appetite has increased significantly. So it wants like Taiwan back. It wants greater dominance in the South China Sea. It wants more leverage in global financial institutions. So this is revision for China. Revisionism is to revise the existing system and the rules-based order, which is again from China's perspective, what are the rules, and for whom are those rules, and by whom those rules are written. Like freedom of navigation, for example, and in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea. These are areas where China's and U.S.'s kind of worldviews collide to a significant extent. For Russia, revisionism is, again, I think it's more about breaking the isolation, kind of becoming more recognized as a great power by the West, reconfiguring or dismantling the Cold War alliances like NATO. So yes, it's both revisionism, China's and Russia's revisionism, are targeted at the U.S., but I think the actual materializations of the two are different.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Alex. Tom, let me turn to you. And at the regional level, you talked especially about the China-India relationship as a potential driver of divergence of interest between China and Russia, just because the Russia-India relationship is so strong. At the regional level, they're all members of several institutions. The BRICS is one, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another. So how effective are those institutions at mitigating the China-India competition or rivalry?
I don't think they're that effective because I think that a lot of these deals, or a lot of the issues have to be dealt with at the top. Because if you're a bureaucrat in the PRC and you're telling your counterpart in New Delhi something, is that actually going to be the case? And we've seen that in the United States, where unless we know that that person has a direct line to Xi Jinping, we don't know if we can actually trust what is going on. So while these organizations and institutions create forum for the leaders to meet to actually hash these out, like I don't think the SCO in particular or BRICS or whatever are hitting home on the issues that matter to India, China, because they're not security related per se. Where like within the Himalayas in particular, like there's really no one else that's trying to mediate that. Like some of the smaller countries are trying to play a role because sometimes the PRC is actually encouraging on their land and it's India that is going in to protect another country's territory. But they create space for the two leaders and the two countries to create other opportunities for cooperation, which could build trust to diminish the tensions there. And like at these summits, it's kind of where they kind of make announcements that we've come to some kind of truce at the line of actual control. But then you create the truce, and then like several months later, you're renaming the places that you say you now have a truce on. So there's a lot within the India-China relationship that is difficult to really parse out because one day it's one thing, the next day it's another. There is some kind of modus vivendi on how they operate, at least in the region, but China's really there in a much greater extent than India is, and India kind of was taken aback by how quickly the Chinese were able to attack when they did years ago, and things have changed. But I don't necessarily think that these are the right organizations because it is a significant bilateral issue, and they don't really want to multilateralize it. And that's something that China has a history of doing, is to kind of go directly with whatever country they have the issue with and not bring in other parties and have other interests at stake.
Okay, thanks. It's interesting that you started your answer to this question by saying, well, it really depends on the high level engagement, right? You have to know, even in these organizations like the SCO, if the Chinese and Indians are talking, it really depends on the interlocutors' access to the center of power, right? So that's the question I was going to ask second to you: is how dependent is this relationship on the personal relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping?
I think, at least when it comes to China, it's very important because the system is so closed off that unless you have assurances directly from him, you don't know if whoever you're speaking to is actually getting the ear and whatever you promise will actually come to pass, because it may conflict with his agenda. For Putin and Xi, they seem to enjoy each other's company. They seem to be friendly. Um, does that relationship hinge on the two of them being in power? I don't necessarily think if one of them goes away, either somehow Putin loses an election, or they're both older gentlemen and one of them could pass away. Will the relationship tank? I don't think so. I think it's too deeply embedded. The two are, at least with Russia in particular, because of Ukraine, is so internationally isolated within the great powers that Russia doesn't have much of a choice for kind of the pomp and circumstance of a great power relationship. With China, I think they could potentially um, lower the importance once Putin goes away, or once Xi Jinping goes away, and whoever takes his place doesn't necessarily get along with Putin as much. But I think that while those interpersonal relationships are key, I don't think it's enough for China to say, like, and fully condemn the invasion of Ukraine, or not want cheap oil and gas.
Okay, thanks. We'll turn to audience questions now because they're coming in. I'll read the first one here. I sense less convergence to see the possible embrace of a trilateral spheres of influence. It appears the Trump administration wants to cede regional dominance to Xi and Putin while expecting unilateral control over North America and beyond, Panama and Greenland. This reduces threat balance, but leaves open to confrontation issues where the regions or core interests intersect. Do the authors agree or disagree, or have insights on this version of a multipolar world? Let me start, Alex, with you, and then we'll turn it over to Tom.
Yes, this is an interesting angle, I think. Look, this multipolarity or bipolarity or unipolarity, these are, of course, simplifications. So the world, I would say, is multipolar to a significant extent. So this, looking at the great powers like US, China, is a way to make sense of a very complex reality. I still tend to think that Trump is not going to give up, or is not going to cede regional dominance to Xi. I anticipate the intensification of the U.S.-China rivalry, and it's a structural rivalry where not only it materializes in different, sort of trickles down into different regions, but ultimately it's power transition, and China gradually catching up with the United States. And the prediction in this case is that the established superpower is not willing to cede its dominance willingly to the challenger. Especially, it's not this power transition is different from power transition from Great Britain to the United States, which was a special case. Here we are talking about different political systems, different cultures, if you like, different priority strategic interests. So I tend to see it more as a China vis-a-vis the United States. This will be kind of overarching structure forming arc, if you like. And Russia, look, Russia is more concerned with, I think, with its immediate geopolitical environment at the moment, and it's been down in Ukraine. Yeah, I tend to see that U.S. will be very reluctant to let China become number one superpower. I would anticipate more confrontation, more contestation between the two.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Tom, anything to add here?
Yeah, I think like it may be true with Europe where Trump is a Eurosceptic and he may care less about what's going on there. But as Alex said earlier, within the context of the Indo-Pacific, I just don't see Trump ceding all of the Indo-Pacific into a sphere of influence. And if we take into consideration Congress whenever they decide they want to do things, that the strong relationships that certain countries like Japan or Korea or even Taiwan may have beyond the executive are important to continuing to make sure that this model of a trilateral sphere of influence does not happen. But I'll caveat that and say a lot of that may depend on how successful his Golden Dome project may be, because if Golden Dome is successful, where's that money coming from? They're going to have to be cut somewhere, and that could be in our forces abroad, because it's going to be so expensive. And then if we somehow actually, if this thing is successful, and if it is successful, I don't think it will be in the next 4 years, but let's pretend it is. We now have, if it works properly, the United States secure. We don't necessarily then need to have forces projected abroad, and then you bring them home. You don't need as large of a standing army because the homeland is protected. Then I could see what Frank, you're kind of hinting at is if we don't need all of these alliances and things to be secure and to prevent other powers from rising, then maybe there could be trilateral spheres of influence. But in the short term, I don't think that would happen. And in the dream Golden Dome scenario, it may, but for the time being, in the context of Asia, I think there are too many other capable powers also at play that they would fight back, and they're not necessarily completely relying on the United States. Like I can't see Japan ceding to Chinese interests very easily.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And for the next question, let's stay with you to start because it's on Taiwan, which is a large part of what you do in your research. And the question is, could we see Russia support China if China decides to invade Taiwan, especially if the invasion is met with American opposition?
I would say yes. It would kind of be a reverse of what we're seeing with Ukraine, where Russia invades Ukraine, China steps up to support Russia. If China invades Taiwan, I would see Russia step up to support China because we would likely see, I'm assuming, a stronger international response given the devastating effects that an invasion of Taiwan would have on global supply chains. Like the studies show, I think it's a 10% global GDP decline, and it would destroy the semiconductor industry. So we wouldn't be able to be talking on Zoom in a few years if China gets what it wants in Taiwan due to the devastation. But I think it would also have the potential to rebalance the relationship where right now it's so asymmetric with China having so much power and international relations abroad not being very isolated. And if it does this, it would break some norms. However, outside of like the G7, I don't know what countries in necessarily Africa or Latin America would do because they abide by the one China policy. But I could see Russia ceding, which it already has, some of its interests with Taiwan. Like Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingkuo, was educated in the Soviet Union. He had a Soviet wife. And they, before the PRC in the last, say, decade, really pushed its narrative to squelch Taiwan internationally, Russia had a very good relationship in the unofficial space with Taiwan. That's not the case anymore. So I think that Russia's getting to that point where if an invasion were to occur, it could supply arms, it could maybe raise the price of oil, but that depends on Russia's status internationally. But I think without a doubt, if the United States is going to support Taiwan or US, Japan, some sort of configuration, I think that Russia would be behind China.
Okay, Tom, thanks. Alex, how about you? Any thoughts on this question?
I more or less agree with Tom's assessment. I don't think Russia will support China directly in the conflict. I don't think there will be joint sailing through Taiwan Strait by the two navies, or Russia really becoming involved into military confrontation. I would probably rule that out because of also the capabilities issues. Russia is pinned down in Ukraine, and it's not easy for Russia to sort of to have this double front, two fronts, two different fronts, two different theaters. But yes, energy, weapons, something similar to what China, probably in a slightly different shape, but kind of indirect support, something similar to what China has been doing since the war in Ukraine. So yes, Russia will stand behind, but will not become directly involved into military operations. That's my assessment.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to follow up. I agree. Like I don't think Russia would be a combatant country per se, but it may utilize that conflict to get some of its other interests dealt with. I'm thinking maybe with its disputed spaces with Japan, if Japan is at war um, with China over Taiwan, it may push further onto some of that issue. I know after the invasion of Ukraine, kind of those negotiations fell apart. And if Europe gets involved, it may push Europe beyond Ukraine. Would it actually go to war with another European country? Probably not. But I could see it utilizing that conflict as other countries are focused on or distracted by to get some of its other interests moved forward.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom. The third question is, how does Xi and Putin view one another's stability in the leaderships of their respective countries? Would they be likely to intercede on behalf of one another in the event of a challenge from within? So, Alex, let me ask you to answer that from Putin toward Xi. In other words, if Xi Jinping is being challenged from within, leadership crisis, coup, color revolution, whatever, what would Russia likely do? And then, Tom, let me reverse it for you and ask, what would Xi Jinping possibly or likely do in the event that Putin is confronted with such a challenge?
Yes, look, this is a tough one. I think more overall, Putin see as a Chinese political system overall as stable, more or less, and see as being kind of occupying his position of power quite well. And even though there are some reports about multiple assassination attempts and all of that, and multiple disagreements, but within the party, and Russia sort of trying to monitor that, but more or less, I haven't seen any immediate significant concerns that China's political system is very brittle and is likely to collapse. Quite interesting, actually, how they presented this. Russia monitored how China looked at the Prigozhin mutiny in Russia. That was a very interesting case, actually. Problem. I'm getting a little bit into Tom's response in Tom's area, but it's quite interesting that China presented Prigozhin's mutiny as a Putin being able to miraculously stop thousands and thousands of armed soldiers, basically professionals and professional soldiers, and that this is an indication of how stable Russia's political system is. So it's usually, and they were making analogies with Turkey and Kazakhstan, where similar mutinies resulted in longer term riots and casualties. But in Russia, sort of by a phone call and by involvement of Lukashenko, this Prigozhin was sort of forced to turn around, make a U-turn, and disappear. So, but yes, going back to Russia's kind of perception of seized power, I think there is a perception that the system is quite stable, and I'm not aware of any scenarios being discussed, scenarios that Xi might suddenly lose power or the system will collapse.
Okay, thanks. And then Tom, over to you for what would China's likely response to be to a real challenge to the Russian system?
Really, as we saw, like what Alex was saying, we saw a real example to that. And we didn't see PLA troops in Moscow to defend the Kremlin. I think that getting involved militarily in that so directly, I think that's off the table for China, because it would kind of blow apart the air of its claim that it does not get involved in the internal affairs of a foreign country. But would she try to like use diplomacy, as Alex was saying, to try to stop such a direct threat? Probably. I don't think. I think that Putin has his leadership. It was threatened at least one point in the last few years. But will they actually go in to defend Putin and make sure he maintains power? I doubt it. A weaker Russian leader could maybe be in the interests of China, someone that they could boss around a little more, and someone who is not as strong or have the support, as deep support as Putin does, could be in the interest of the PRC. But I don't really see Xi Jinping like using all of his personal weight to keep Putin in power. I think he has his own issues at home, particularly with the PRC economy. But like, as Alex was saying, I think the PRC system is much more stable, and kind of flipping it, like it seems like once a year there's a rumor that there's a possible coup in China, and we don't see Russian troops going in to save or stop whatever rumors are happening. So like we have these examples, concrete and hypothetical, and we aren't seeing like the deep support that you may, or at least in the public sphere, behind closed doors. Things may be a bit different.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is, do you see any impacts to nuclear proliferation in Japan and South Korea based upon Russia PRC convergence and the DPRK's increasing nuclear capabilities? Does this undermine the U.S. extended deterrence umbrella? Let me start with you, Tom, and then Alex.
I would kind of flip the premise and say that nuclear proliferation in Japan and Korea may be more dependent on the trust of the U.S. extended deterrence. And if Japan or South Korea does not necessarily trust that we would trade New York for Seoul or whatever in a conflict, they may go nuclear. And I think like in South Korea, those conversations have been happening much more significantly than in Japan for obvious reasons. There's a new leader in Korea who's made some comments on this, but the previous president who was impeached was much more of a proponent, and the Biden administration nipped it in the bud by reaffirming the nuclear umbrella applied to Korea under the ROK U.S. treaty. Now Trump's in power, and he historically has not had great relationships with the South Koreans, so they may be less trustful of what Biden's promises were. So I think that it's more of what they perceive to be from the United States than North Korea. Like obviously North Korea plays a role. If North Korea is going to be accepted as a nuclear state, then South Korea will quickly do that. But I think it is more based on the lack of trust or immense trust that they have on whether the United States will actually use its nuclear umbrella to protect them.
Okay, thanks. Alex, what's your perspective on this one?
Yeah, well, I think there are a few questions here. Nuclear proliferation. I think it will be very difficult for Japan and South Korea to cooperate on this issue. There is a very difficult history between the two countries. Actually, quite interestingly, I've just attended a policy dialogue in Canberra, and there are some talks. Those are not mainstream talks, but there are talks about nuclear cooperation between Australia and South Korea, saying that, especially after Trump announced this revision of AUKUS Pact. So some corners of Australian expert community and academia are talking about the possibility of that. Basically, South Korea has the technology and Australia has the minerals, the resources. So that hypothetical, of course, this is a very hypothetical scenario, but if US-Australia alliance becomes less reliable from Canberra's standpoint, so this is the possibility. And also question mentions North Korea. This is a very complex issue actually, and recently I've also encountered two conflicting depictions of the recent Russia-North Korea military alliance. And this one is an alliance, not an alignment, because it includes explicit defense pact, so defense commitment. So one interpretation is that this is sort of China indirectly helping Russia and sort of channeling weapons and shells and other forms of assistance through North Korea to Russia to minimize reputational costs. However, there is a opposite interpretation, conflicting interpretation, is that also Tom mentioned that Russia has this dormant fears of China in the Far East, and this alliance with North Korea is actually to contain China in the Far East, because having an alliance, and North Korea wants to diversify its external relations, and Russia is kind of signed this alliance to contain China in Russia's Far East, and having a nuclear armed ally in North Korea is an effective way to achieve that. So this just probably to throw some wrenches into the wheels and to complicate things a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, and the report, the final section of the report, before the conclusion at least, is future trajectory of the relationship. So it's unfair to ask you to predict the future, especially giving you 60 seconds each. But in the 2 minutes or so we have remaining, if you could each take about a minute to describe what you see as current drivers of the future relationship. In other words, what's happening now that is likely to have the greatest effect on the relationship 10 years from now? Let me start with you, Tom, and then I'll turn it over to you, Alex, to give you the last word.
I think the biggest short-term factor is the Trump factor. What level of trust other countries in the region will have for the United States in the short and long term, because as we discussed a bit in the report, what effect will Trump have on the long-term foreign policy of the Republican Party is unknown at the moment. Is this a Trump-specific issue, or will this be a long-term realignment of the Republican Party? And will the Trump factor create cleavages within the U.S. relationships and alliance system in Asia that they may seek to have better relations with China or Russia? We don't know. And I think like the issues with the tariffs is a key point. They're pushing other countries out and finding new economic relationships, depending on how bad or the tariffs might be when and if they come back, that there may be a new realignment within the system in the long term. And we're just starting to see that happen now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Tom. Alex, over to you for the final word on this.
Yes, I think short to medium term, China-Russia alignment is likely to consolidate more, to become stronger. But longer term, in the long term, I agree with Tom that U.S. or Trump factor, if you like, or the factor of U.S.'s foreign policy is extremely significant, because it hits the structural push actually to be behind China-Russia alignment. So if it is real that the United States is giving up on the European security and on Ukraine, and hypothetically, if it goes even further when it comes to, let's say, the like Crimea, whether it's part of Russia or not, I think this is strong enough kind of changes that might maybe not completely reverse, but slow down China-Russia alignment.
Okay, thanks. Well, that was well done. We just hit the 1 hour mark. So thank you, Tom and Alex, not only for writing this report, which is really an interesting read. It will be on the FPRI website soon, so please check back and you'll be able to download a copy of it or read it on the website. So thanks to Tom, thanks to Alex, thanks to FPRI, thanks to the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command for its sponsorship of this entire 5-part series on China-Russia relations in the Indo-Pacific. And thanks to everybody who joined us.